This presentation is based on a review and interpretation of a peer-reviewed study published in Animal Production Science in 2020. The original research evaluated dairy cattle supplemented with common bean residue, also known as bean straw hay. Rather than generating new experimental data, this review applies the intake and digestibility findings from that study to beef cattle production systems. The emphasis is on understanding whether the responses observed in dairy cattle can help explain potential nutritional risks in beef cattle. Beef cattle operations commonly rely on low-cost forages and crop residues during periods of forage shortage, which can occur seasonally or during drought. While crop residues can help maintain cattle when traditional forages are limited, their contribution to animal performance varies widely. This variation depends not only on nutrient content, but on the animal's ability to consume the feed, the energy density of the residue, and overall nutrient availability. Bean straw hay is becoming more readily available as dry bean production increases, and laboratory analysis suggests it contains enough fiber and crude protein to appear suitable as a forage or forage extender. However, forage quality in beef cattle diets is not determined solely by nutrient concentration. Voluntary intake is often the primary limiting factor, particularly with bulky, fibrous, and low-energy residues. When intake is reduced, total nutrient consumption declines regardless of laboratory values, increasing the risk that cattle fail to maintain adequate energy balance. The primary objective of this review is to determine whether including common bean residue in beef cattle diets reduces voluntary feed intake and total nutrient consumption to a level where it becomes nutritionally ineffective. The emphasis is not simply on whether bean straw contains nutrients, but whether cattle can consume enough to meet their nutritional requirements. The secondary objectives focus on management strategies that may reduce the risks associated with feeding bean straw hay. Specifically, this review examines supplementation approaches and control of inclusion rates that allow bean straw to be used safely without negatively affecting body condition, growth, or reproductive performance in beef cattle. The selected study evaluated lactating dairy cows managed in a grazing system and supplemented with increasing levels of common bean residue. Researchers measured voluntary feed intake, nutrient digestibility, and feeding behavior while maintaining forage as the primary dietary component. This design allowed for evaluation of how common bean residue influenced intake and nutrient utilization without replacing forage entirely. Although lactating dairy cows were used, the physiological measurements collected were not production-specific. Processes such as intake regulation, rumen fill, fiber digestion, and feeding behavior function similarly in both beef and dairy cattle. Because the study focused on total intake, nutrient supply, and digestibility rather than milk yield, the findings are applicable for evaluating how beef cattle may respond to bean straw hay in forage-based diets. The cattle used in the study weighed approximately 1,100 pounds and were managed in a grazing-based system with minimal use of concentrated supplements. These conditions closely resemble many beef cow-calf and stocker operations, particularly during periods of forage scarcity, when supplementation is used primarily to extend forage intake, rather than to support high levels of production. Increasing levels of common bean residue were incorporated into the diet while forage intake was continuously monitored. Response variables included total dry matter intake, energy intake expressed as total digestible nutrients, crude protein intake, fiber intake, total diet digestibility, and feeding behavior metrics such as time spent eating and ruminating. The primary finding related to the use of common bean residue in beef cattle diets is that its successful use is limited by its tendency to reduce voluntary feed intake. In beef cattle systems that rely heavily on forage intake to supply energy and protein for growth or body condition maintenance, this intake limitation represents a significant nutritional concern. As the level of common bean residue supplementation increased, total dry matter intake declined. There is about a 35% reduction in voluntary feed intake when including bean straw hay. This response is especially important in beef cattle systems because animal performance is driven by total energy intake rather than the energy concentration of the diet alone. Cattle only get about 68% of their energy needs from bean straw hay. In systems where cattle receive little supplemental energy or protein, any reduction in forage intake directly results in reduced nutrient consumption. Cattle consume on average a 30% reduction of nutrients when eating bean straw hay. Reduced dry matter intake led to decreased total energy intake and crude protein intake, in some cases falling below recommended values for mature beef cattle. These nutrient deficiencies increase the risk of reduced average daily gain, declining body condition scores, and reproductive challenges, particularly in late gestation or early lactation beef cows. Fiber and crude protein digestibility did not differ across levels of common bean residue inclusion. However, stable digestibility did not compensate for the reductions in total nutrient intake caused by depressed voluntary intake. As a result, intake regulation instead of digestibility represents the primary nutritional constraint associated with the use of bean straw hay in beef cattle diets. Time spent grazing and ruminating did not change as levels of common bean residue increased. However, as dry matter intake declined, feeding efficiency also declined, meaning cattle consumed fewer nutrients per unit of eating time. This indicates that cattle were not able to compensate for reduced intake by altering feeding behavior. Cattle did not adjust their eating behavior to compensate for reduced intake when consuming bean straw hay, particularly when supplemental energy was limited. Collectively, these findings demonstrate that although the digestibility of common bean straw hay is acceptable, restriction of voluntary intake represents the greatest challenge to its use as a primary roughage source in beef cattle production systems. Any feedstuff that depresses voluntary intake presents a greater risk in low-input beef cattle systems, where forage provides most of the metabolizable energy and supplementation is limited by cost or logistics. Under these conditions, reduced intake of a low-energy, high-fiber roughage, such as bean straw hay, is more likely to result in negative energy balance than in more intensively supplemented production systems. Diets based on bean straw hay are high in fiber and low in energy density, which limits the amount of usable energy consumed per unit of feed intake. Because of this low energy density, cattle may reach physical rumen fill before consuming enough feed to meet their daily energy requirements. As a result, cattle can appear physically satiated while remaining nutritionally deficient, creating a maintenance trap that compromises body weight and condition. Bean straw hay is low in metabolizable energy and low in available protein. In addition, fiber-bound protein and secondary plant compounds such as tannins can further limit protein utilization. Because supplementation is often limited in beef cattle systems, cattle are particularly susceptible to energy and protein deficiencies when bean straw hay is used in the diet. From a management perspective, bean straw hay is best suited for use as a roughage extender rather than as a primary forage source. It is most appropriate for cattle with low nutritional demands or in situations where intake can be closely monitored. Examples include dry cows, emergency feeding situations, and short-term forage substitution when adequate energy and protein supplementation is provided. Bean straw hay should not be used for cattle with high nutritional requirements, such as growing calves, backgrounded cattle targeted for high gains, or cows in late gestation or early lactation, unless substantial supplementation is provided. To prevent unintentional nutrient deficiencies, it is critical that bean straw hay be strategically included in the diet and supplemented appropriately. No toxicological risks have been identified when properly cured. Contaminant-free bean straw hay is fed to cattle. However, the primary health risks are indirect and stem from chronic intake depression. In extensive beef systems, gradual declines in body condition may go unnoticed until reproductive performance or immune function is negatively affected, highlighting the importance of regular body condition monitoring. The phosphorus in bean straw hay falls 70% short of a cow's needs unless supplemented, but additional health concerns associated with bean straw hay include the potential for mineral imbalances beyond phosphorus, including excessive dietary calcium, can interfere with phosphorus absorption and long-term skeletal and reproductive function. The crude protein deficit of bean straw hay falls 30% and reduced effective protein availability, as fiber-bound protein and secondary plant compounds limit ruminal degradation and metabolizable protein supply despite acceptable crude protein values. The energy dilution in bean straw hay is 35%, and with energy dilution of the total diet, high fiber content lowers overall dietary energy density and increases the risk of negative energy balance when supplementation is limited. The use of lactating dairy cows rather than beef cattle represents a limitation for direct application of the study. However, key physiological processes such as intake regulation, rumen fill dynamics, and fiber digestion are consistent across cattle types. Therefore, the intake depression observed in the study reflects a fundamental ruminant response to low-energy, high-fiber diets and is applicable to beef cattle production systems. Long-term responses in beef cattle remain unknown, as the study evaluated short-term intake and digestion responses in lactating dairy cows rather than cumulative effects over an entire production phase. Growth performance, body condition dynamics, and reproductive outcomes were not measured, limiting the ability to directly assess how intake depression would translate into economically relevant beef cattle responses. Beef-specific research is required to evaluate long-term impacts of bean, straw hay on performance, reproduction, and nutrient balance under forage-based beef production systems. At first glance, common bean straw hay has a lower as-fed purchase price than many traditional forages, which can create the perception of immediate cost savings when feed decisions are based solely on price per ton. These apparent savings can be misleading because lower voluntary intake and reduced nutrient consumption may require additional supplementation that increases total feeding costs. Nutrient-adjusted costs provide a more accurate economic comparison as they account for usable energy, digestible protein, and mineral balance rather than purchase price alone. When evaluated on a cost per pound of total digestible nutrients, common bean straw is the least expensive source of energy compared to Timothy hay and alfalfa hay. Timothy hay is 13% higher and alfalfa hay is 20% higher per pound of total digestible nutrients. However, the differences in energy cost among common bean straw, Timothy hay being 8% more and alfalfa being 16% more, are relatively small, meaning bean straw does not offer a substantial economic advantage when energy supply alone is considered. As a result, bean straw hay is best suited for meeting maintenance energy requirements, particularly in cattle with low energy demands, rather than supporting growth or high levels of production. Because for this aspect, bean straw hay is 13% cheaper than Timothy hay and 20% cheaper than alfalfa hay. A major economic limitation of common bean straw hay is that it supplies very little digestible crude protein per ton, providing substantially less usable protein than traditional hay sources and limiting its ability to meet protein requirements without supplementation. Compared, Timothy hay with 40% more digestible protein and alfalfa hay with 80% more digestible crude protein. As a result, bean straw has the highest cost per pound of digestible protein, making it the least economical protein source among the forages, compared when evaluated on a nutrient-adjusted basis. When protein supplementation is required to correct these deficiencies, the initial purchase price advantage of bean straw hay is rapidly reduced or eliminated, in turn increasing total feeding cost. Common bean straw hay contains high calcium but very low phosphorus, creating a mineral profile that does not align with beef cattle requirements when fed without supplementation. The resulting calcium-to-phosphorus ratio is severely unbalanced, greatly exceeding recommended ratios and increasing the risk of impaired phosphorus utilization. Phosphorus supplementation is frequently required with bean straw hay, adding hidden cost and management complexity, particularly in late gestation and reproductive cattle. Cost effectiveness depends strongly on cattle class because differences in nutrient demand determine whether bean straw's low purchase price offsets its intake, protein, and mineral limitations. Bean straw supplies 65 to 70% of baseline energy intake at higher inclusion levels, which may be adequate for maintenance cattle, but not for growing or lactating animals. Compared to alfalfa, bean straw provides 17% less energy per ton and 80% less digestible protein per ton. Compared to Timothy hay, bean straw provides 8% less energy per ton and 43% less digestible protein per ton. Bean straw is best suited for maintenance situations where cattle have low energy and protein requirements and performance losses are less economically consequential. Bean straw provides maintenance energy at 13% lower cost than Timothy hay and 20% lower cost than alfalfa hay. However, bean straw typically meets only 25 to 30% of phosphorus needs, compared with 75 to 85% for Timothy and 60 to 80% for alfalfa. Increasing supplementation needs even in maintenance systems. For cattle with low nutrient demand, bean straw can meet 70 to 80% of total nutrient needs before supplementation becomes critical. Strategic use determines true savings as supplementation required to correct protein, energy, or mineral deficiencies can quickly eliminate apparent cost advantages over traditional hays. Protein supplementation may be required to replace 30 to 50% of required protein when bean straw replaces Timothy or alfalfa. Adding protein and phosphorus supplements can eliminate 50% of apparent feed cost savings relative to Timothy hay. Compared with alfalfa, bean straw's lower purchase price can be offset entirely once energy dilution and protein deficit are corrected. Laboratory nutrient values describe what is present in the feed, not what the animal actually consumes or utilizes. Forages like bean straw may appear adequate on paper, yet fail to meet requirements due to intake limitation or nutrient availability constraints. Voluntary intake governs total nutrient delivery in beef cattle systems. When intake is restricted by rumen fill or low energy density, animals cannot compensate through digestion or feeding behavior, regardless of laboratory nutrient concentration. Body condition, growth, and reproductive success are all downstream outcomes of sustained energy and nutrient intake. Chronic intake depression leads to negative energy balance, which often manifests first as reproductive inefficiency before visible weight loss occurs. Bean straw hay should be introduced gradually and used at controlled inclusion rates to avoid excessive dilution of dietary energy and protein. Monitoring intake response is essential, as increasing inclusion levels can reduce voluntary feed intake and compromise total nutrient consumption even when laboratory values appear adequate. Because bean straw hay is low in metabolizable energy, digestible protein, and phosphorus, supplementation must be planned deliberately rather than reactively. Protein, energy, and mineral supplements are often required to maintain nutrient balance, and failure to account for these needs can quickly eliminate any apparent feed cost savings. Bean straw hay is most appropriate for cattle with low nutritional demands, such as mature dry cows or animals maintained during short-term forage shortages. It is poorly suited for growing, lactating, or late gestation cattle unless substantial supplementation is provided, as intake limitations and nutrient deficits are more likely to impair performance in higher demand classes.